Okay, guys. So we're doing market structures. Market structures basically, if you look at a big picture, we're going to look at something like this. So this is our discussion going to be. We have on one extreme we have what we call perfect competition. Okay, and on the other extreme we will have what we call monopoly. So this chapter will focus on perfect competition and monopoly. Okay, we'll talk about what is perfect competition, what is monopoly in a little while. But then we have in between, we have monopolistic competition and oligopoly. Somehow or the other, perfect competition is always compared with sometimes what we call perfect monopoly. Now, what do you mean by perfect? The word perfect here and perfect here is simply that when you look at the monopoly, we are looking at an extreme case of monopoly. Only one firm. Normally, if you ask me what is the definition of monopoly, anyone with a 51% ownership will be called a monopoly. But either what we're saying here is not like a monopoly per se, but like a perfect monopoly, only one firm. So we are looking at extreme, a perfect example of perfectly extreme example. Okay. Similarly, either I am looking at infinite amount of firms. So the first chapter that we are about to do in this market structure, this chapter 4, is going to focus on the perfect competition and perfect monopoly. Okay. And once we've done the two extreme cases, we will then start to relax our assumptions and we'll go to monopolistic, monopoly. And there's some small things that are within this two extremes. Okay. So the word perfect means what? The word perfect means the assumption extreme. Okay. And they are so perfect that you're not tweaking or you're not changing those assumptions. With time, we will sort of change those assumptions, and with time, we will move from perfect to monopolistic to oligopoly and so on and so forth. Got it? Now, just a quick sort of understanding that either when we look at this one, we're looking at infinite number of firms. People who are online, if you have any questions, guys, you can write here, and even if I ignore it, people here can tell me there's a question. Okay. So also, if any point in time, if you want to sort of unmute yourself and talk, you can also do that. But you can also write. So guys, perfect competition, the one thing we try to look at is that there's infinite amount of firm versus one firm. Okay. Here you were looking at a price taker versus a price setter. Okay, so we'll see the extremes to happen as we move along, and I'm going to make a table in a little while. But the idea that we look at when you look at this spectrum is basically, like how much power does a firm have, what kind of a demand curve you have, how much competition are you sort of facing, what kind of product are you selling, are you selling a completely identical good or non-identical, and so on and so forth. So I want to do today's class. I want to sort of do is basically talk about this table, okay? And I want us to make this table rather than us reading this table. Let's just make this table so that it becomes useful for us, because I want to make it slightly differently than what is given here. So, I'm going to have perfect competition, okay? Then I'm going to have monopolistic competition. Okay, so here I'm going to write, by the way, just to make you understand, here I'm going to write the features. In fact, okay, so number of firms. So monopolistic competition is 1, and then we have oligopoly, and lastly we will have monopoly. Okay, this table is going to be useful because it will help us compare and contrast and have a fair idea कि जो अभी हम करने वाले, because this chapter is long. We're in October. We will for the next 3 weeks at least, we are doing chapter 4 and chapter 5, if not longer, for sure. We're doing it. Okay. Uh, so guys, perfect competition, when you look at number of firms, they are very many. Very many means infinitely large. Versus monopolistic competition, there are many firms. Oligopoly, you will see there are few firms. And I'm looking at pure monopoly, pure or perfect monopoly. That's why I'm going to look at one firm. Okay, so the first distinguishing feature is basically how many firms do you have in this market. Now, a good way to look at it is this, that a fruit seller or a vegetable seller is likely to be in a perfect competition market. But if you are, for example, if you look at O-level schools are many, while A-level schools are few. So O-level schools could be in a monopolistic competition setting, maybe, I'm just saying it, and A-level schools could be few, that's why they could be in an oligopoly setting. Many O-levels, but very few A-level schools. You know what I mean? And that too dominated by few firms. That is also a case. And then pure monopoly would be, K Electric would be an example, one firm in the market. K Electric could be one firm in the market. So, like looking at different industries. Okay, so perfect competition, fruit salad is a great example. Okay, then comes the next feature, which is basically called freedom of entry. Do you have any questions? If you have any questions, please ask me. Freedom of entry. What do you think, guys, is happening with the freedom of entry? How easy it is for you to enter in this market? In other words, what are the barriers to entry? We say in perfect competition there is no barrier to entry, or in other words, the right way to use is this: there is complete freedom of entry. Okay, so there's no barrier to entry. You can easily come and go. The setting up isn't a challenge in this. There is no entry cost per se. In a monopolistic competition, we assume the same thing. There is complete freedom. It's not challenging to set up, for example, an O-level school. We assume that. It's not going to be that difficult. In reality, तो होता है कोई भी स्कूल आप खोलना चाह रहे हैं. But अब कहते हैं कि अगर बहुत सारी firms हैं, so it must be easier to set up the business. In oligopoly, there is what we call challenges. A good example of this oligopoly market is Coke versus Pepsi. It's a very good example. Cola market में दो player हैं आपके पास, which is Coke and Pepsi. And the reason why people can't really easily enter is because there are many strong barriers to entry. So यहाँ पे I'll say freedom of entry is limited, while pure monopoly, I'm going to call it completely blocked. Completely blocked. Do you get it? Does that make sense? It's completely blocked. So you can't enter this market that easily. People who are at home, are we sorted? Everyone at home, are we sorted? Does that make sense, guys? Yeah? Are we good? Okay, great. Fine. I've opened the camera here as well so you guys can see me. Although I can't see myself. Should be able to see myself. That's me. Okay. Okay, guys, are we going to move on? So the second part is freedom of entry completely blocked. Is there any question about it? Yeah. So how is, for example, cola market, in a cola market, you are blocking people to come into the market is simply, if you look at Coke and Pepsi, the number of units they sell is huge. So there are tons of economies of scale that they have. The marketing budget Coke and Pepsi has is huge. They have a huge retail network. Their distribution is all over the country. If you want to compete with them, you've got to put a lot of money to compete with them. It's not going to be easy, right? In an A-level market, where do you get the limited freedom of entry? It's the teachers. You sign the teachers. You have the right kind of teachers. You pay them the right kind of money, and that's how you are able to sort of create that entry point to not happen. Why aren't many O-level schools extending to A-levels? Is because they notice that for A-level, then you then have to have specialist teachers, which becomes challenging. It's not easy, and so on and so forth. Got it? So freedom of entry is kind of like limited in that manner. Make sense? Then comes the next point, which is basically after freedom of entry, we're looking at the nature of the product. Nature of the product. What do we mean by this? So, what kind of product are you selling in this market? It's important to know what kind of product you're selling in this market, because if you're selling a product that has that is identical or not identical, in a perfect competition, we believe you are selling something completely identical. Or another word for this one is we are selling something homogeneous. Homogeneous means identical. For example, a tomato seller is selling tomatoes, which is exactly how another seller is selling. There's no brand loyalty, there is no product differentiation. ऐसा नहीं है कि यार इसके ईरान के टमाटर हैं, मेरे पाकिस्तान के टमाटर हैं, इसके कश्मीर के टमाटर हैं, मेरे सियालकोट के टमाटर. I don't know. I'm just making it up. There is no, a tomato is a tomato. There's no branding. There's no distinction per se right now. So everyone is selling an identical or homogeneous product, and there is no distinction whatsoever. Number one is that point. Number two is that point that like if your product is slightly different, for example, if your product is slightly different, then you're not in perfect competition anymore. Then you will be in what we call a monopolistic competition, where the good is basically non-identical product. Okay, and non-identical means something very important. Non-identical means suddenly there is some kind of brand loyalty. Suddenly there's some kind of differentiated. So non-identical का other दूसरा नाम होता है differentiated. Right? And you will agree with me, a lot of O-level schools are out there, but are they selling identical code? And the answer is no, they're selling some differentiated products. Some would say we have a play-based curriculum, someone would say we have a project-based learning, somebody might say we have a God knows what kind of thing. Somebody may say we are, I don't know what do they say in O-levels to sell their product, but what I'm trying to say is basically there is some differentiation. You go to city school, differentiation होती है थोड़ी सी. आप जाते हैं सीधे जाएंगे कुछ और differentiation है O levels में. For example, Bayview is a different school, Mama Parsi is all girls, so they might sell tradition and all that, and God knows different product, different kind of features. So they are not selling identical goods, and that's why there might be some kind of brand loyalty that is seen in monopolistic competition. Make sense? Versus either in identical good, you might not see any brand loyalty. You can just go and buy it from anyone. It doesn't really matter. Here, it does matter who you buy it from. While here, in oligopoly, we also believe there could be differentiated product. But funny thing is, there could also be a possibility of identical product. Differentiated, so, you can say Coke and Pepsi is differentiated, for example. But what about identical? And the funny thing is that the cement sector in Pakistan or the sugar sector in Pakistan is actually very oligopolistic. Very oligopolistic. Why? Because only few people with really deep pockets are managing the sugar and the cement in this country, for example. So there could be a possibility that you might be in an oligopoly selling identical product, but yet you are not perfect competition, but you are basically oligopoly. इधर तो सबसे बड़ा differentiating factor in a monopolistic competition is that you're differentiated. Otherwise, these guys are like completely identical. Like perfect competition, monopolistic competition, the biggest difference is this, right? In an oligopoly and perfect competition, there are many differences. Very, very many firms, few firms, complete freedom, limited, identical versus possibility of differentiated product. Make sense? Restaurants. Where would you put restaurants, guys? Restaurants that you have oligopoly or monopolistic competition? Oh, well, I would say it depends on, like what kind of a restaurant are we talking about? Perfect competition is mushkil hai because सबकी कोई ना कोई ब्रांड लॉयल्टी है. So perfect competition might be a difficult one to say. It might be monopolistic and oligopoly के बीच में, depending on what kind of restaurant are we talking about. If you're talking about the dhabas out there, you know, like the ones that sells you naan and you know, that kind of dhabas. I know you guys have encountered that or eaten food there. You should, by this age, you should have eaten that food at dhaba. If you haven't, maybe post corona, try eating food. But if you have, that's monopolistic competition. Like सुबह आप हलवा पूरी खाने जाते हैं तो यहाँ पे बड़ा मशहूर एक है टूसो. टूसो 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 राइट. मैं समझा था पहले, you know, टूसो, I used to think it was टूसो, like you were like टूसो खाना टूसो, you know, sorry, but then I realized it's actually टूसो. What does टूसो mean, by the way? Nobody knows. But Tuso is a place for halwa puri, and so therefore there might be other places as well, and they might be operating in what we call a monopolistic competition market. It might not be oligopoly, although they might be very popular, but they may not be oligopoly. So then comes pure monopoly. Pure monopoly, here you have what we call a unique product. आप अकेले हैं इस market में, you're the only one selling, and that's why you are. Umar, you're saying something. TIC, monopolistic TIC. I don't know what you're saying, Umar. You can help us what you're saying. You can unmute and tell us. Otherwise, if it's not important, we can move on. Are we good? Is there any question? Spelling सही कर रहा था. मेरी spelling, अपनी spelling. Sorry. Okay. कोई मसला नहीं है. कैपटॉप में. Okay. मेरी स्पेलिंग भी सही कर सकते हो. बाय द वे मेरी स्पेलिंग को खास अच्छी नहीं है जब मैं पढ़ा रहा था. ओके, नेक्स्ट कम्स, यू नो, लाइक एग्जांपल्स. लेट्स टॉक अबाउट एग्जांपल्स हियर. सो इट्स गोइंग टू बी गुड टू टॉक अबाउट एग्जांपल्स, एंड आल्सो वी टॉक अबाउट डिमांड कर्व. हाउ डज डिमांड कर्व लुक लाइक? व्हाट आर द एग्जांपल्स ऑफ परफेक्ट कंपटीशन? एनीवन? Vegetable sellers, you know, since we are at it. Any other example that comes to our mind? People online. Any examples that can come to your mind for perfect competition? Mobile phones. Which one mobile phones? Like iPhone wala. Are you talking about mobile phone sets? If you talk about, it's a very big oligopoly market. इतनी आराम से नहीं घुस सकते आप. Of course, there is China, which is Chinese brand, जो कि हो सकते हैं बहुत सारे हैं, but I would put it Chinese brand. And then there is iPhone and then Samsung and all that. It's a pretty monopolistic market. I mean, oligopolistic market. Or by the way, जो SIM है, cellular providers, that's also oligopoly. I mean, tomorrow if I want to set up a business like Telenor, will I be able to even get a license? And the answer is no. License भी नहीं मिलेगा, बल्कि आपको सोच भी नहीं सकते अगर आपका minimum capital एक requirement होगी. I don't think so. It's fairly oligopolistic. I think there's no two things about it. Monopolistic competition means the one example we're saying is restaurants. How do you spell restaurants? UAR. Restaurants. Any other example? We say O-level schools is an example of that. But restaurants is a fairly good example. Now restaurants there could be two kinds of restaurants. One is basically, let's talk about fine dine restaurants then. You know, when you're looking at fine dine, you know, like maybe you're looking at the more expensive part of the restaurants. I don't know. Then you are looking at few restaurants to be out there. You know, like maybe Okra or Cafe Flow are examples of like the really expensive fine dine restaurants. So Pompeii, you know, steak might be expensive or whatever. So you can say that those are like fine, or like Japanese food ke liye, Sakura and Fujiyama, examples of like fine dine. Maybe you can say they're not monopolistic, they are oligopoly market. I don't know. So within restaurants also you have category, but then you have let's say nahari wale जो आपकी पूरी category है. नहारी के लिए आपके पास साबरी नहारी है, आपके पास रजा. नहारी वालों के नाम बताओ. जावेद, जाहिद. You have suddenly Nahari, Malik Nahari. सबकी अपनी एक नहारी होगी. You know, like somebody will say, you know, I want to go to eat at Malik. Somebody says Nahari, and somebody may say Sabri, somebody say Javed. Depending on where you live, depending on, like that kind of thing. So if I ask you, you guys all might have similar names or different name and all that. So this is basically monopolistic competition. If you're feeling hungry, join the club. Okay, utility stores, Umar is saying, is an example of what? Monopolistic. I think utility stores utility stores would basically be an example of, again, depending on like Aghaz and Spring stores, or for example, Imtiaz, you're looking a lot of capital to be put in. So I'll call that to be an oligopoly kind of a setting, versus monopolistic competition could be your other stores that are out there. Okay. So in oligopoly, you have car industry, a very good example of. Airline industry is another one. Or if you look at identical products in the cement industry, cement and sugar are examples of oligopoly. What about monopoly? In monopoly, you're looking at a case of public utilities. Public utilities क्या होती हैं? Like K Electric, for example, or for example, your SUI, SSGC, SNGPL, SUI Northern Gas Private Limited, Pakistan Petroleum Limited, whatever. So like these are examples of what we call oligopoly. Now we're going to do one more thing, which is called implication on the demand curve. Petroleum industry is a very good example. Ali Abbas is a very good example of, I would say, oligopoly, but because extraction में हो सकते काफी firms हो, लेकिन like Shell and ये आपका जो Total and all that, they're oligopoly. Selling identical good, by the way. That's a very good example. Ali Abbas is, because they are selling the same petrol. ये जो आपको बेचते हैं कि जी, this is what do you call the two categories? High octane, and the other one is premium. Is basically different name for the same thing. Everyone is getting it from the government, and government gets it, whatever, imports it, and then it gets sold by different brands. This product is the same. Okay, maybe शायद कोई दो नंबरी कर रहा हो in terms of like putting something in it, but otherwise they're all the same stuff. Now, implication on demand curve. What is the implication on the demand curve? And the answer is that when you look at implication on the demand curve, in a perfect competition, you're looking at a perfectly elastic demand curve. Okay, it's perfectly elastic. Why? Because you're a price taker to begin with. What about monopolistic? We say it is relatively elastic. So it's downward sloping. You have a downward sloping, but relatively elastic. Why? Because there are many firms out there. Competition is high, but not super lot of firms. There is some kind of brand loyalty that makes you slightly different from another person. Like if I asked you guys, do you have a preferred sort of milk brand that you drink? If you drink milk, you guys, I don't know whether you guys drink milk or not, but and my answer would be yes, I have a preferred brand. Is the brand loyalty super strong? Will you not drink? No, I might move on. Or barber, do you go to or tailor for girls? If you get your clothes staged, do you have a particular tailor? And the answer is yes. Is there a tailor that you will always go to? Yes. But what if he's not available for months? Will you switch? Yes. Will you say no tailor, no clothes kind of a thing? No, you won't say that. Or no barber, no haircut. No, you won't say that. You will definitely wear clothes from a different party or get a haircut from a different person. But your brand loyalty is kind of there, but not like do or die kind of a बाल कटाने तो उससे वरना मर जाएंगे बाल नहीं कटाएंगे, that kind of a thing. You won't do that kind of a thing, right? So that's what it is. Okay, so what about this one, oligopoly? We say relatively inelastic, because suddenly you have a stronger brand in the market, you have market power, you have significant brand loyalty to begin with, and so on. Okay, so you have a relatively low. Now, what about this month? What about pure monopoly? A lot of people think pure monopoly should have a perfectly inelastic demand curve, but that's not true. Perfectly inelastic demand curve is a category, if you remember from AS, we saved it for a life-saving drug. Like life-saving drug is a perfectly inelastic demand curve. You're willing to pay anything. If K Electric asks you for anything, will you pay? And the answer is no. You may start to look for a subsidy for K Electric if they are really expensive. घर में generator लगा लेंगे. You might go with solar panels. You might go with no electricity for that matter. If they ask for $1 million per unit, you're not going to pay that. Your life doesn't depend on that. So we believe it's not going to be perfectly inelastic, but very inelastic. And not perfectly inelastic. Not perfectly inelastic. It's important to understand because it's not a life-saving drug that they're selling. If they were selling a life-saving drug, we would have agreed with that. But no, they're not selling life-saving drug. Does that make sense, guys? This is a very good table to look at because as we move along from perfect competition to monopoly, this table will bring us back to, okay, this is the assumption. So that's why this is the feature. And therefore, the implication of this will be seen in revenue and then therefore in profit. Cost structure diagrams are the same. Remember, cost structure diagrams will be same for all of them. What will be different will be the demand curves, revenue part, and therefore the profitability part. Okay, so we'll see that. At least in the short run, the revenue becomes a distinguishing feature. Make sense? Are we good? Any questions, guys? We are done today. Awesome. Sorry? We might always shift from PIAs. PIA is basically an example of an oligopoly. You're right, Hibab. You are saying, but we might shift from PIA to another airline if there is no seat available. How would it be relatively elastic then? Well, the idea goes is that in a market where Hiba, you are operating, for example, who is competition to PIA right now? PIA and Serene. Is there any other third player? A Blue, fourth player. Can I say the market has like less than 10 players? Like I think there might be only 4 players for that matter. Shaheen still flies. I don't think Shaheen flies anymore. Umar, I think Shaheen बंद हो गई है. अगर तुम Shaheen का टिकट में कोई तुम्हें बेचे तो कहीं जाना मत. कहीं जा पाओगे कहीं जाओगे नहीं तुम basically. So जहाज में पहुंचोगे तो जल्दी से. No, what I'm trying to say, guys, to be honest, if there are 3-4 players in the market, then it is an oligopoly. See the Jannat. Yes, we might go to Jannat if Jannat is the place that you have sorted for yourself. What if आपके गुनाह इतने हो कि आप जन्नत ना जा पाए, लेकिन hopefully इंशाल्लाह ताला पाकिस्तान में तो जहाज से जो भी जाता है वो शहीद हो जाता है, right? पाकिस्तान में नहीं. Okay, guys, thank you very much. I shouldn't be talking about this while the lecture is being recorded. Somebody might take me away. Thank you. Khuda Hafiz. Bye-bye, guys.